All right. Just wanted to thank the organizers for including a paper in the program. This is joint work with my colleague Daniel Carroll at the Cleveland Fed, and these are our views and not those of the Fed. Okay. So in this paper, we're interested in understanding the distributional consequences of tariffs, and this question is partly motivated by recent trade policy the last couple of years, and also kind of Fed's recent interest in inequality. So on the one hand, tariffs have an effect on labor markets or trade in general. Fernando Pero has documented that trade increases the skill premium. That's a benefit for skilled households, at the expense of unskilled workers. And this is consistent with Autodorn, Hansen, and Song, who find that low-skilled workers are harmed more from opening the trade. So trade, expansion of trade, or in contrast, tariffs, which will reduce trade, will have an effect, a differential effect on skilled versus unskilled workers. In another paper of ours, we've also documented that trade and tariffs have an effect on prices, and tariffs which will lead to higher prices of tradable goods and services. Well, this also has distributional consequences because poor households are more sensitive to tradable consumption prices because tradable expenditures are a bigger share of expenditures for poor households relative to wealthy households. So in this paper, we wanted to study the consequences of tariffs across both the skill and the wealth distribution, kind of thinking about these effects jointly. Okay, so today we're going to introduce a very simple Ricardian trade model with non-homothetic preferences. We want to kind of generate a distribution over income and wealth, so we're going to use this kind of uninsurable income risk with borrowing constraints setup. You can think about we're basically merging together a very simple Ricardian trade model with a very simple Iagari type macro heterogeneous agent model. We're going to have skilled and unskilled labor, so we can relate back to the skill premium. And then there will also be distortionary taxes. So why do the distortionary taxes matter? Well, here we want to think about trade, but more specifically tariffs, which generate tariff revenue. So there's going to be some costs associated with that, but the revenues can then be redistributed back to households. And because we have heterogeneous households, lump sum, although we're going to have a version of the model where we lump sum redistribute the tariff revenue, which is more commonly done with representative agent trade models, we do have heterogeneous agent models, or we do have heterogeneous agents. So we study alternative ways of redistributing tariff revenue, and this can be both through labor income taxes or capital income taxes. So using this model, we're going to study the distributional effects of tariffs, and there's a number of different ways that we can we can do this exercise. So first of all, do the trading partners retaliate or not? There's various ways of redistributing tariff revenue, as I just mentioned. And then in our baseline, we'll have perfect mobility across sectors, but then we'll also discuss, there's some kind of interesting takeaways when we also study the version without mobility. Okay, so I'm gonna kind of confirm this kind of, I think, which is kind of an incorrect Minnesota stereotype that I'm just gonna jump straight into the model. Okay. So, all right, so there's two countries. So again, this is going to be a very, very simple, on the trade side, it's going to be very simple. Two countries indexed by I. There's going to be households that are going to choose the amount of consumption, work, and how much to save. There's going to be two types, unskilled and skilled households. And these households are going to face uninsurable labor income risk. So they'll have periods of high productivity, they'll face periods of low productivity, and during those periods of high productivity, they're going to want to accumulate wealth for precautionary reasons. For when they fall on more difficult times, they'll have that wealth to buffer their consumption. On the production side, there's going to be a tradable and a non-tradable sector. These goods are used for both consumption and for investment. And then there will be a continuum of tradable intermediate goods. There's going to be a government that taxes to finance some exogenous expenditures. And we'll also have capital skill complementarity. And this is going to lead to the fact that trade increases the skill premium. So when there's expanded trade, tradable goods become cheaper, investment goods also become cheaper, so that leads to capital deepening. And when capital is more complementary with skilled labor than with unskilled labor, you get this increase in the skill premium. Not unlike the mechanism in Fernando Pero's model as well. Okay. So there's a lot of kind of agents in the model. I will spend a little bit more time on the non-trade, so the stuff that's kind of relatively new. But just with an overview of the model, we're going to start with the production of non-tradables and capital. So you have capital producers that combine non-tradable and tradable goods. And then you have the non-tradable producer. And we're just gonna, this is, very simple. So you have a representative firm that produces some non-tradable output YN. These guys are going to choose high-skilled labor, low-skilled labor, and capital to produce according to this production function. I'll just keep it as F for now, but I'll specify the production function later. Again, we're going to choose a production function that displays capital skill complementary. So capital is going to be allowed to have different elasticity of substitution with high skilled labor and low skilled labor, and it's just going to be display higher complementarities with high skilled labor. So the non-tradable good in country 1 is going to be the global numeraire. Okay. And then, as I mentioned before, there's going to be an investment firm that combines tradable and non-tradable goods. They're going to, in a Cobb-Douglas fashion, produce these investment goods, which the households are going to purchase to invest in capital. And then this gives you a formula for the price that's a function of the tradable price and the non-tradable price, which we've normalized to 1. So again, when trade expands, the price of tradable goods are going to go down, and that's the effect that will lead to investment prices going down as well. Okay, so the production of tradables. So there's going to be a tradable producer. So this is the final tradable producer. They're going to combine intermediates that are produced domestically, but also produced from the other country. And then when the sourcing of these intermediate goods are from the foreign country, they're going to suffer some trade costs. This trade costs can have both a kind of an iceberg transportation cost type of element as well as a tariff. Okay, so the representative final tradable producer bundles all of these varieties that are indexed by omega into a final good, and they solve this profit maximization problem. So that's the price, the tradable price. So that's the price at which they're selling these tradable goods, and then they need to choose where to source these intermediate goods. If they choose to source it from a foreign country, they are paying these transportation costs. And then this is just a standard CS aggregation across these varieties. So notice that there's imperfect substitution across varieties, but within a varieties, whether you purchase that from country 1 or country 2, those are perfect substitutes. Okay, so then we can solve for the demand function, and then this will give us the formula for the tradable price. Okay, so the intermediate good. So we're going to think of an intermediate good producing or intermediate firm producing a single variety, tradable variety, and for each variety, this can potentially be produced in country 1, country 2, or by both. And these are price takers. So taking the price as given, they're going to solve this profit maximization problem where they're choosing high-skilled labor, denoted by H of omega, unskilled or low-skilled labor. They're also renting capital. And here we've made the assumption that they're using the same production function as the non-tradable producers. That can be relaxed. especially for the quantitative side of the model, that it comes at very little cost. But analytically, just the expressions become a lot simpler when we assume that the production functions are the same. Yeah, and in particular, the assumption of perfect mobility across sectors, workers can freely move between the tradable and the non-tradable, and then the assumption that they have the same production function and the same elasticities with the non-tradable sector really simplifies this the zero profit price, because they face the same set of factor prices.
Excuse me, sorry,
yes.
a question. So
yes.
you see you were normalizing the price of the non-tradable?
Yes, the non-tradable good in country 1. It's going to be the global numeraire.
That will be the global numeraire. Okay.
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. Otherwise, here in this expression, you would have had, you know, you would have seen all these factor prices, but because they face the same set of factor prices as the non-tradable producer, and because they combine these factors in the same way, that's why we're seeing the 1 here instead of a combination of the factor prices.
But then wouldn't there be something other than a 1 in the other country?
Well,
I was kind of thrown off by the same thing as Lorenzo was. It seemed like you were making something the numeraire, which would differ by country.
Well, yeah. So the other way, yeah. Okay, so that's right. So yeah, sorry. So okay, yeah, that might be a little bit misleading. So basically, what we're gonna do is assume that in each country, the non-tradable good in each country is the numeraire, and so in country 2, you also have this expression as 1 over z, and then in terms of solving for the real exchange rate, you can then reconvert things so that we're expressing things as the country 1's non-tradable numeraire.
I'm not sure if you can do that. I think what you can assume, maybe that's implicit what you're assuming, it's free trade, and it's actually a free tradable good. It's not really a non-tradable good at the end. And then you can pin down the price across everywhere if you want. You can make it equal to 1. What you call it non-tradable at the end, it seems to be like a free tradable good.
Sean, I think this is because in one part of the paper you assume that countries are symmetric, and when countries are symmetric, then you actually get this result. But then I think later on you assume no symmetry, and then this breaks.
Yeah, it's possible that we have so many different versions of the model, but yeah, I will look into that. Yeah, sorry for the confusion. Okay, but yeah, for now, just think of there's a PIN instead of the, you know, just replace this 1 with the PIN, and then in the case of country 1, this is 1 over zi. Okay. Okay, and then we're just gonna for simplicity, we're gonna assume that these the productivities for these omegas are distributed according to this exponential function, so that country 1 is going to be more productive at producing the high omegas, and country 2 is going to be more productive at producing these low omegas. So I'm assuming that kind of this is more of a trade literature, so kind of everyone understands how at least this part of the model works. So I'm just going to skip this. So, you know, there's some effective prices in the this is the free trade equilibrium. There's perfect specialization, complete specialization. When there's transportation costs or tariffs, the imported prices go up, and that leads to these regions of no trade in the middle. Okay. All right. So next is the households. So the households are kind of in this model, kind of where all the action is at. So the households purchase non-tradable and tradable goods for their own consumption. They produce these, they purchase these investment goods to accumulate capital, and then they're also supplying labor to the non-tradable producer as well as the domestic intermediate tradable producers. Okay. So we'll just go straight to the recursive formulation. So a household are different across skill. So they have a skill type of J. They live in country I. They come in with a certain level of wealth, and then they come in with a certain productivity shock. Okay. So these are the dimensions along which the households differ in the model. So these households are then going to choose how much consumption of the tradable good, how much consumption of the non-tradable good, how much to work, and how much to save for next period. and they're going to solve this recursive programming problem. So this is the utility function, which is, obviously increasing the tradable and the non-tradable good, and decreasing in hours worked. And then the budget constraint is their income is coming from their labor income, and the W tildes are just the after-tax wages. So they have some labor income, they have some capital, the returns on their capital, and then they might have some lump sum transfers. Using these incomes, they are purchasing tradable goods, purchasing non-tradable goods, as well as investing in capital. Okay, and then going into the next period, they face these kind of income productivity shocks, these uninsurable productivity shocks. So they might transition to higher productivity states. They might transition to lower productivity states. Okay, and I said everything here that I wanted to say. Okay, finally, there's a government that finances in the steady state at least, a constant stream of wasteful expenditures, in the sense that they don't enhance productivity, or they don't enter the household's utility function, by collecting taxes on labor income, on capital income, on tariffs, and potentially there's also lump sum tax and transfer as well. Now, I usually skip this this kind of equilibrium definition, but I think it's useful just to point out what are the things that are exogenous and what are the things that are endogenous in the model. So in the steady state, given these fiscal policies, there's the value and policy functions of the households, the producer plans of all the producers in the economy, and then prices, which are the high skilled wage, the low skilled wage, the interest rate, the tradable price, the investment price, and then in the asymmetric version of the model, we also have the real exchange rate, and then also the price for each intermediate good. And then we have these invariant distributions. So, kind of the usual: households optimize, firms optimize, all the markets clear, we're gonna have balanced trade. Now, there's a government budget constraint, which in the steady state isn't that interesting, but when we raise tariffs, when we study that transition, we're going to allow the government to use that tariff revenue kind of one policy at a time to choose these tariff or tax reductions that make the overall budget neutral. So, in the labor income tax reduction, we're going to have to kind of solve for the sequence of labor income tax rates that balance the government budget, for instance. And then I'll explain a little bit, because I think it was Tim that asked us to have a slide for computation. So I'll talk about a little bit about that. But in these types of models, the equilibrium object is to solve for the kind of the invariant distribution. So I'll chat about that a little bit more later. Okay, so the tradable price, once we determine, which set of goods are produced where and what goods are traded, we plug that into the price aggregator, and we get this, the expression for the tradable price. And here I explicitly am assuming here there's symmetry, just so that we can look at some analytical expressions. So this is basically 1 over some measure of aggregate productivity, and here we can see that trade costs are going to distort the extensive margin by shifting around the the measure of goods that are traded. It also distorts the intensive margin. Conditional on importing a good, you're going to be able to use less of that because it's more costly. And here again, we can see that when when trade costs go up, tradable prices are become more expensive. Investment is going to be more expensive, and that's going to lead to capital falling in the aggregate, kind of leading to a reduction in wages and things like that. Okay. So that was basically the description of the kind of very simple model on the trade side, at least. And then so we're going to calibrate this model to match some features of the U.S. economy. We're thinking of 2 countries, so we'll have U.S. being country 1 and country 2 being the rest of the world, made up of basically the OECD and China. And here, roughly the rest of the world is going to be twice the size of the U.S. So the size here is going to matter because we'll have both kind of bilateral and unilateral tariffs, and that that depends on the size and whether or not the other country retaliates. Has an effect on the real exchange rate and in terms of trade. So the experiment that we're going to do is we're going to raise U.S. tariff 5%, and this is a kind of like a kind of like a MIT shock. It's there's a one-time unanticipated increase in the tariff, and that's permanent. So we'll be solving for the transition to this with the higher tariff equilibrium. And we'll look at it with and without retaliation and with and without redistribution. And then I'll talk a little bit about kind of repeating the same exercise when we shut down the mobility across sectors. Most of these things are standard, except if you haven't seen these kind of like IAGRA type models in a while, we have to kind of calibrate the discount factor so that we have households kind of saving the right amount of capital, and so we're going to target the wealth GDP, which is close to 5. And then we had these non-homothetic preferences. So we'll have the gamma, which governs the tradable expenditure share, which is about 35% in the U.S. And then to pin down this non-homotheticity parameter, we'll just use kind of across the wealth distribution. I had mentioned before that poor households spend more of their expenditures on tradable goods. So we'll just use one moment, which is kind of looking at the wealthiest quarter, which spend 31% as opposed to, on average, they spend 35%.
Sean?
Yes.
Can I ask you a quick question? So
yes.
you have a one asset model, which are
yes.
calibrating to this relatively high value of the wealth to GDP ratio. So it means
yes.
that, if I remember correctly, that's going to imply that then your model is going to be close to a representative agent model. You're not going to have a lot of, I would expect that there will not be a lot of individuals close to the constraints. And so I was wondering whether that's going to undo a little bit the effects of these credit market imperfections, and whether, I guess we'll see that in the results we're going to show, but whether it would be, given that you're targeting this high wealth to GDP ratio, whether it would make sense to instead write down a two asset model so that you could get the high wealth to GDP ratio and a more important role for precautionary
right. So you want to think about, so you want to think about the return on this asset as being like the total return. So like, we're not going to think about the interest rate that we saw from the model as being like the risk-free interest rate. You want to kind of think about this as being like a combined asset. And then in terms of kind of the households that are constrained at a given moment in time, we used to have an additional parameter here that we used to calibrate to pin that down, which is the borrowing constraint. Here we just we just have a non-negative wealth constraint, so K has to be greater than or equal to 0. But you could think of that being there's no reason why you think that that shouldn't be negative. So we used to pin down that kind of borrowing constraint to pin down the share of households that have non-positive wealth, which is about kind of depending on how you define it, but like 15-16%. And it turns out K greater than or equal to 0 kind of gets you there. So that's just kind of in a sense, at any moment in time in the steady state, you're going to have about 15% of households that are actually at the borrowing constraint.
I see. Then I guess it would be interesting to understand why this particular method does a much better. So in their recent review paper, Greg Kaplan and Gianluca Villante have this fact that in a standard one asset model, if you target the wealth to GDP ratio, that's going to generate MPCs that are way too low relative to what we measure in the data. So I guess the fact that you have a large fraction of individuals at the constraint suggests that you're going to get the MPC right. And then I guess it would be quite interesting to understand what's this alternative mechanism in the model, additional mechanism that gets you.
Right. So I'll show you a couple of kind of moments that the untargeted moments that we do well at hitting, and then there's some that we don't quite do as well in matching. So you can ask me again.
Okay.
Okay. So in the interest of time, I'll just kind of skip over these other ones. Okay, so here is the capital skill complementarity, and so this is kind of similar in spirit to the functional forms used in Stokey, as well as Crucell, Ohanian, Rios-Rural, Violante, as well as in Fernando Perro's paper. There's slight kind of variance, but the basic idea here is that capital, this kind of nested CES function, allows for different elasticity of substitution between capital and skilled labor, which is governed by chi, and capital and unskilled labor, which is governed by zeta. And so here we're going to use these kind of values that are used in these papers. And so this will just lead to the fact that capital is going to be more complementary with skilled capital or skilled labor than it is with unskilled labor. Okay, and then we'll just assume that these productivity shocks follow an AR1 process, and we kind of estimate these from the PSID based on skilled and unskilled labor separately. It turns out that what matters is really the income profile after controlling for a bunch of the observables, but the actual stochastic process itself, they don't seem to be that largely different. But we did do this kind of estimation, so we'll just use these separate parameter values. Okay, so just a quick slide on the solution algorithm. So basically, as is common in these types of models, basically you're going to kind of, on the outside loop, you're going to have to solve for some prices. And in the inside loop, given prices, you first solve for optimal household decisions. So these are, how much they work, how much they consume, and how much they save across the distribution. Then, as I mentioned before, you need to solve for these invariant distributions. So basically, using the household decision rules and the shock process, then you can compute the invariant distribution across productivity and wealth by skill. And then once you have these these distributions, then you can compute all the aggregates. So how much wealth is there, how much aggregate consumption, how much aggregate hours, and then using market clearing and the firm optimality conditions, that'll give you conditions by which you can then update your prices. Now that's the steady state. So the steady state can be solved like really quickly. Additionally, solving for the transition path is going to involve solving for the entire path of prices and aggregates, including all the budget neutral tax rates and transfers, depending on whether it's the labor income tax or the capital income tax. So what the constraint here is really the computational time it takes to along the transition, because we do have these capital skill complementarities, the model responds quite sensitively to small changes in prices. So that's really the only constraint in terms of us trying to add more interesting things to the model. Okay, so all right, so basically we're gonna increase the U.S. tariffs by 5%, and then first we'll show the case where there's no redistribution. So basically the government collects all this tax revenue and it just increases government expenditure. So there's going to be that's going to lead to higher tradable and investment prices. That'll lead to capital shallowing across time. Wages will fall, but because of capital skill complementarity, there's going to be a larger fall in the skilled wages. It's just in reverse the kind of the gains from the trade that accrued more for skilled workers. Okay, so in the no redistribution case, and actually these three graphs are pretty similar whether or not there's redistribution or not. So here, basically the blue line is where there's no retaliation, and the red line is full retaliation by the trading partner. So that, when tariffs go up by 5%, tradable prices go up, investment prices go up, and basically when there's no retaliation by the trading partner, it's kind of similar, but it's just kind of muted. And the reason why it's muted is you have this depreciation in the real exchange rate and an improvement in the terms of trade. So when there's no retaliation, you're kind of having the other country pay for part of your tariffs. So here it looks like there's a one-time jump and then there's constant prices. And there's small movements in the real exchange rate, but you'll see more of the dynamics once we look at the other factor prices. Okay, so because these kind of look very similar, one is just a muted version of the other. Today I'll just, in the paper, we discuss both cases, but today we'll just focus on the case where there's full retaliation. Okay, so now, because I don't want to have to do all the 4 different cases separately, here I'll just show all the graphs with the 4 different cases. So the blue line is basically the government expenditure. So you raise government expenditure with your tariff revenue. The dashed red line is the capital income tax reduction. So you hear, even with a 5% tariff, you can actually reduce the capital income taxes quite considerably. So, for instance, going from like 18% to 9%, it's a fairly large reduction. There's a smaller reduction in the labor income tax. because there's a bigger base. Labor income is higher than capital income. And then the lump sum transfer. So in all these cases, except for the capital income tax reduction case, which is kind of a special case. So you raise tariffs and you reduce capital income taxes. So on the one hand, you have you should expect capital shallowing because investment prices are higher. But on the other hand, there's a capital income tax reduction. So those kind of cancel out, and you actually get a modest capital deepening. So that's why, in terms of the capital dynamics, that's the only case that looks different. So because you have capital shallowing in the transition, you're going to have temporarily lower after-tax net return on capital. And I should have started here, I guess. The capital is shallowing in all these cases except for when you reduce the capital income tax. The lump sum transfer case sees an even larger capital shallowing, and that's because when you have lump sum transfers, it's a form of insurance. It reduces the need for households to self-insure, and so that's going to lead to less capital over time. Okay, and as a result, when we look at what happens to wages when there's capital shallowing, which happens in all the cases except for when you reduce the capital income tax, you're going to see a wages fall. But they're going to fall by much more in the skilled. So the skilled wages are going to fall by more, whether you're in the government expenditure case or you're in the lump sum transfer case. Now, obviously, when you have a labor income tax, because wages are falling because capital is falling, but there's also an income tax reduction, you actually do see that, for in the case of the dashed black line here, you do see a modest increase in the skilled wage after tax. And then a larger increase in the unskilled wage. And that's because they have the same income tax reduction, but the unskilled guys are harmed less by the fall in the capital stock. Okay, so when we look at, so with the exception of the capital income tax case, which leads to more capital and higher output, output is going to be permanently lower in all these cases, and as well as consumption. And again, with the lump sum transfer case, households have less incentive to accumulate capital, and so capital falls. So you have this biggest reduction in capital. So here's kind of a word of caution. So if we just kind of look at the output ranking, so not only is this kind of not only is it orthogonal to welfare, actually the rankings are kind of reversed when we think about welfare. So we'll turn to welfare now. So welfare depends a lot, obviously, on how tariff revenue is going to be redistributed. Without redistribution, tariffs harm everyone in the distribution, but the skilled households more than the unskilled, and poor than more than the rich. With redistribution, labor income tax reduction is going to give you the highest higher average welfare than the capital income tax reduction. It's also going to be more equitable across the distribution. It will have lower GDP. And in the case of the lump sum transfer, you actually get a small average welfare increase. And this is coming from more insurance. So this is really going to benefit low skill and poor workers. And so this happens even when there's full retaliation by the partner, which I thought was kind of interesting. Okay, so in these types of models, the way you compute we're just going to define consumption equivalence. Basically, how much would initial steady state consumption have to be permanently increased for a household to be different to going through the entire transition with the increase in tariffs. So just because now I'm running out of time, so when we just look at average welfare, and this is the full retaliation case, you see that obviously if there's no redistribution, that gives you the highest welfare loss. The labor income tax reduction is kind of almost welfare neutral. The capital income tax is considerably more costly, and then the lump sum transfer case, there's a small welfare gain on average. And then across the welfare or across the distribution, these are representing the percentage of the households that have a welfare gain. And the reason why this 67% is significant is that this 67% basically represents all unskilled households. So all unskilled households prefer this kind of tariff and lump sum transfer scenario, whereas all the skilled households do not. Now, when there's no redistribution, it's much easier for there to be welfare gains because basically you have the other country paying for your tariff. You're having the other country pay for these tax reductions, and you can get much broader welfare gains in general. So because we wanted to think about across the wealth distribution, let's just kind of look at these graphs. Basically, yeah, and in the paper, and I can click on these, but I'm going to run out of time. We break this down by skill, and obviously the case where there's no retaliation, and also all the different decompositions at what goes into these numbers. So basically, across the wealth distribution, as I mentioned before, if there's if you don't redistribute the tariff revenue, this is going to hurt everyone, especially going to hurt poor households because things just get more expensive and they consume more of these goods that just got more expensive. So that more hurtful for the poor households. You can see that the capital income tax reduction, this has the best kind of aggregate outcomes. There's more capital, there's higher output, and it does benefit a lot these wealthier households. And this is basically units of annual GDP per capita. So the average is around 5. The median is lower than that. So it really benefits these wealthy households, but it really kind of skews the welfare losses in favor of the wealthy. And then, and then as I mentioned before, the labor income tax reduction is the most it has these on average people lose, but at least the losses are kind of equitably distributed. And then the lump sum transfer case, you see a lot of the kind of poorer households. Remember that a lot of households Okay, so the main takeaways from here are that poor and skilled households are going to lose when we just kind of purely look at the loss side, the cost side of the tariffs. Poor and skilled households lose the most. The welfare consequences are really going to depend on how tariff revenue is redistributed. Reducing income taxes or increasing lump sum transfers can generate some winners, whether or not there's retaliation. But tariffs with retaliation almost always reduce average welfare. And finally, I just wanted to, I guess, I may not have time, but when you shut down sectoral mobility, you actually get some very interesting. I mean, in reality, we think of the world as being somewhere between perfect mobility and zero mobility. But when you shut down mobility altogether, basically sectoral wages are going to do the most of the movement. So basically tariffs are going to lead to a large reductions in both the skilled and unskilled wage in the tradable sector. And that's going to mute actually, because now tradable producers have these lower wages. And so the price of tradable goods aren't going to go down by nearly the same magnitude. So the investment prices don't go down or don't go up in response to tariffs. So you have these very different aggregate dynamics, but in terms of the concentration of welfare losses are going to be much more concentrated to people in the tradable sector. But in terms of average welfare, it's actually kind of similar, these two versions, or these kind of two extremes. So I guess kind of as a preview of next steps, we're thinking about having maybe limited mobility across sectors, since we've learned that really the perfect mobility case and the no mobility case has very different consequences in terms of aggregates and the distributional consequences of welfare. So that's kind of something that we want to explore. And then finally, because in the pandemic, you can imagine that poor households and maybe unskilled households are bearing the brunt of the costs of the pandemic. And because tariffs are also kind of hurting similar dynamics, how costly are these tariffs during regular times versus during the pandemic? And so that's kind of a work in progress that we have. Okay.
All right, great. Thanks, Sean. Ricardo. So Sean, if you unshare, yep, good. Ricardo, now you can share.
Can you see that?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay. So let me get started. I'm a 5-minute discussion, so I'm gonna go a little bit fast. So in just one slide, so what does Sean and Daniel do in this paper? They basically want to study heterogeneous effects, and in particular welfare effects of tariffs on households. And the key is that they can do it across multiple dimensions, right? So they're going to do it across labor, skill, income, and wealth. But an additional important part of the paper is that they're going to look at the welfare consequences under different redistributive policies, right? So they're not only going to think about lump sum transfers of tariff revenues, but they're going to look at the consequences of thinking about different redistributive policies. So why? I think, well, you know, Sean did a great job motivating the paper. I just want to say that, you know, we need to move forward in order to understand these distributional consequences, both in terms of qualitative features of the discussion and quantitative ones. So in this case, you know, qualitatively they add this additional margin of heterogeneity, which is wealth, and quantitatively, of course, they have a model that they can use to address this question. So very quickly, how do they do it? They're basically going to take a dynamic two-country Ricardian model. It's going to be DFS basically, and they add 3 ingredients to the basic DFS framework, which is these different labor skill types. Basically, they think about high and low, non-homothetic preferences. In particular, poor households are going to be more exposed to tradable goods, or they consume their expenditure on tradable goods is greater than for rich households. And in addition, in order to be able to talk about wealth, they think about this, you know, uninsurable and idiosyncratic risk and borrowing constraints, so basically incomplete markets. And, you know, what does it mean? It basically means that households can save, and there is a reason to save, right? Because you want to insure against these shocks that are hitting you all the time, and you don't know when it's going to be good, when it's going to be bad. And then they're basically going to consider a 5% increase in tariffs and analyze the welfare effects on their different policies, as I said before. Now, they have tons of results. Sean didn't talk about many of those. I think, you know, one of the results that you can, I want to stress that with this paper, you can actually find that you can study things along the wealth distribution, right? So one of the results that they found consistently across different distributive policies, other than the tax on capital, is that basically the poor, but also educated, are the ones that get hit the most, right? So why? Because these are the guys who cannot insure against the risk, and at the same time, so they're gonna get hit the most. They're closer to basically the borrowing constraint, and so their marginal propensity to consume is very high. So the shock to consumption is going to affect them a lot. But also the guys who are educated, given that there's going to be capital shallowing, they're also going to lose. Okay. The other one that I think it's pretty interesting is how they can undo the effect in terms of GDP and capital when you use an effect of the capital tax. But then in the end, you know, in terms of welfare, it's actually not welfare improving. So I just want to focus on 2 comments, which are pretty general. But before that, let me just put this paper in a nutshell, like put it in the literature, or try to put it, you know, this is the way I understand the paper. If you think about a super simple version of the model in which there's no labor supply or anything, you can just solve for the indirect utility function, conditional on capital, skill, and the shock. And you can basically decompose this utility into 3 parts, right? So on the left, you have wages, right? And there's a long literature that has studied how trade shocks affect wages across different skills. If we go all the way back to Stopper Samuelson, and well, back in the day it was capital and labor, now it's more about skill and non-skilled workers. And we can think about the work of Bernstein and Vogel and Fernando's work, and there are hundreds of papers about these issues. Then if you go all the way to the right, you can think about how these effects are going to vary along the income distribution, right? By varying these shares, the shares of expenditure on non-tradable goods. So depending how much you consume on each good, how exposed you're going to be to the trade shock, right? You can see there that when there's an increase in the price of tradables, the poorer people are going to be more exposed to this shock. In addition, in this paper, they have this wealth margin, right? So here I'm thinking about a steady state, and I'm being very sloppy and hand wavy about everything that's going on with the shocks, basically because in the end, capital and these shares are endogenous objects, right, of the equilibrium. But basically, you can see there that along the wealth distribution, also the effects of trade might be different, right? This is something that I mean, we need to keep digging, and there's not a lot out there of people who have studied this. There are a few recent papers, the work by Spencer Leon and Mike Waugh, and Sean has another paper, and I've been working on this stuff, but related more to skill acquisition. And you know, there are a few people pushing in that direction. So let me jump straight to the comments. The first comment is, this is a paper about the distributional effects of tariffs. And you know, at least I consider myself a trade economist. I was immediately think about, you know, Stopper-Samuelson effect. What's going to happen to the wage premium? In this case, there's nothing happens on impact, right? Because if you think about it, technologies are the same across all the varieties, across sectors, everything. So basically here, other than the fact that the labor supplies might change differently across the type of workers, there's nothing going on. So everything is working through capital skill complementarity, right? So the fact if the wage premium goes up or down, it's going to depend entirely on what happens to capital in the long run or along the transition. And I think this is quite important if you want to actually think about a decomposition of the different channel, or you call these channels, the expenditure channel, the income, the investment channel, and so on, the channels through which changes in tariffs affect you know, workers differently, or how, in this case, households differently. So basically, how important are so let me try to ask the question in a different way. So how important are these effects? Actually, I have this paper with Sharon Triberman and Eva Van Limput, where we do basically like a Caliendo Parro paper kind of approach, you know, EK plus multiple sectors, high links, and so on. And we put in dynamics and capital accumulation, and we put in the basic capital skill complementarity. These are the results that you get. So let me just to explain very quickly. On the left, you see the experiment where we do a 5% increase in tariffs across all countries. The one on the right is the actual tariff war, the U.S. China tariff war. But I just want to emphasize something. On the left, you see that for the U.S., which is not very clear here, unfortunately, because the paper focuses on emerging markets, the effect on the skill premium is all light blue. That actually means that the effect comes entirely through capital skill complementarity in the long run, or most of it. So that's what happens in the long run when you let capital adjust, right? So in the case here, actually, this kind of goes in favor of the fact that you don't have to put it differently, it doesn't matter that much if you don't have this Stopper-Samuelson effect. Now, if you think about the U.S.-China trade war, which is on the right, actually you see that the light blue line or bar starts above 0. It means that actually the skill bias, if you don't allow for skill capital for this adjustment in capital accumulation, it actually would go up, right? So and then actually the fact that the U.S. would accumulate capital over time would push the wage premium down. So I mean, just to think about these issues, I think it's important. If we have other exercises in the paper where actually the Stopper-Samuelson part plays a much more important role because we have these HO forces and so on. But I mean, I think you should think harder about this and address it in the paper. The second comment, I'd love to see more about wealth dynamics in the paper, right? I mean, in the end, you focus a lot on what's going on with the aggregates. And the nice feature about the paper is that you have what's going on in the cross section, right? Across wealth levels. So the wealth distribution is changing over time. How? I mean, we know that it's not going to be changing a lot, and we know that in this model, specifically in the new steady state, probably the distribution is going to shift, but it's not going to be very different. Another question is, does the initial wealth distribution matter for the effects of trade? I mean, put it differently, if you assume another process for AR1 process for the income shocks, and then you start from a different distribution, what's going to happen? Are things going to look different or not? I mean, I just want to point this out, but because one question that came up that I had is, what if you only had two types of agents, hand-to-mouth workers and capitalists, right? Would you actually get all, I mean, in the aggregate, you will probably get all the same effects that you showed us, but what's cool here is that you can actually look at the entire wealth distribution. So in my work with Gaston and Axel, which we actually focus on something different. We focus on skill acquisition. We actually look at, what happens. In that paper, we focus on what happens to college enrollment after you see a trade shock. And here we see that, only the rich who have enough money to actually pay for college are the ones who are gonna enroll, right? And so basically this means that the initial distribution matters for how comparative advantage is gonna evolve over time and what's gonna happen in the end, right? So I think you could do those type of exercises and focus a lot more on that additional dimension. As I said, I think I actually went over the 5 minutes. So I have many other comments. These are the two, big picture comments that I wanted to point out. I think it's a great paper. I'm working on similar stuff, and I think there's a long way to go and to move forward. And I enjoyed reading the paper. It's pretty clear. Thanks.
Cool, great. Sean, you want to take a few minutes to respond?
Yeah, thanks, Ricardo, for the excellent discussion. I want to respond to a couple of your questions, and then I realized that I didn't respond to Adrian's questions. I thought I had these coming up. So just quickly, yeah, these were the targeted moments. Great job with the calibration. That's fine. Yay, Daniel. Some of these non-targeted moments. So like in terms of like, generating the distribution of wealth, consumption, and income, we get somewhere, but it's not like all the way. So, the model isn't doing perfectly in terms of generating the wealth distribution. Of course, we can add like kind of bells and whistles so that we can get, wealth distribution with a fatter tail and all that stuff. So that's kind of, maybe something that we'll consider doing. But then when we look at, some of these correlations between capital and productivity and capital and consumption, and consumption and output. So, we do really well on some dimensions, but then on other dimensions we fall short. So like, our sense is that if we do add these bells and whistles that do a better job of getting this wealth, like a fatter wealth distribution, we do a better job in these other dimensions as well. Now, going back to, so the Stouffer Emerson, I think that's a really good point. We have thought about this, and I guess we didn't put enough attention to this in the paper. But yeah, so basically, I mean, if you notice that we're thinking about this as the trade, the trade partners were kind of the OECD plus China, right? So in some sense, this is not the typical like north-south type trade where you're trading across very different types of goods, and you can think of China as being more abundant in unskilled workers, but kind of the evidence in your paper as well as other evidence that skill premiums have increased in Mexico and China as well during growth in trade, I think kind of points to at least among these type of trade partners that that this kind of capital skill complementarity might be playing some significant effect. That's not to say that the Stouffer-Samuelson effects are not going to be relevant for trade with other partners. So the wealth distribution effects are going to be really small, just because we're looking at a 5% tariff, and there are kind of small changes in wages across the skill distribution. So it's going to have some effect, but they're not be huge. I mean, if you were studying like a 20% tariff, I think that would be a different story. And then more importantly, I think that's a really good comment about kind of, what if we had hand to mouth? And you really kind of think about how the model works. If you had hand to mouth households, basically, these basically hand to mouth households are saying that you're poor forever. And so like that would really magnify the wage effects and the expenditure effects. The fact that tradable prices go up, in our model right now, you're only poor, temporarily. You're poor now, and in expectation, some periods into the future, but it's just a temporary. So now you are impatient, so you're going to kind of discount the future. But still, like the fact that you eventually might become rich, or you move away from the borrowing constraint, that kind of puts a kind of lower bound on how bad these are for the poor households. If they were hand to mouth, it would be much worse, I think, because you would be really magnifying the fact that these guys are permanently poor. They're always spending more of their expenditures on tradable goods, and that stuff just got expensive. And there's no way for them to kind of use their wealth to smooth out these kind of low income shocks. So I think that's an excellent question that we haven't really thought about it that way, but I think it would, if anything, kind of magnify the kind of the pro-poor effects of trade.
Because I think if you actually, you don't never plot the measure of workers along the wealth distribution. My guess is that most workers are, you know, very close to zero or to being borrowed constrained, right? To being constrained.
Yeah, well, as I said, yeah. So no, I mean, we should plot that. Yeah, so it's about, you know, the calibration gives you roughly about 17% of households are at zero, and a lot of those guys are unskilled. So you know, you're going to get some of that, and there is a big correlation between skill and wealth and income, and you know that kind of showed in the correlations that I showed, but.
Okay, so we'll just leave the stream open, but we're going to reconvene in just a few minutes. So if anybody wants to ask Sean or Ricardo a couple more questions, we'll get going. We'll say we'll get going in another 5 minutes or so.
Actually, I had a question. So it was really interesting to see that. I mean, so depending on the degree of redistribution following the shock, you get positive or negative welfare changes. Sorry, following the tariffs. I was wondering, what is the size of the redistribution you need to achieve the positive welfare gains? Is it huge? Is it something that seems completely infeasible, or is it something that, you know, could be, you know, we think in some way plausibly implemented? I was just curious to know.
Let me make sure I understood the question. So, like, if you just, are you asking if there's like some level of tariffs other than the 5%, where even if the other country retaliates, you can plausibly get a welfare gain? Was that the question, or?
No, I think you had one of your cases where, you know, even I think I can't remember if it was with or without retaliation, but where with redistribution you could get a net welfare gain in the aggregate. Is that
yes?
After yes.
So
my question was like, but that required lump sum transfers to individuals, and I was wondering, say, could you show this, you know, these lump sum transfers relative to, you know, income of these individuals and see just how big they are, to get a sense of whether, you know, that would be a
oh, sorry, yeah, I didn't, okay, yeah. So what I showed was that when you have retaliation, the only way that you can plausibly get an average welfare gain from the tariffs is when you have the redistribute using lump sum transfers. So I think that your question is, okay, how big are these transfers?
Exactly.
And the transfers are very small because the tariffs are 5%. Tradable goods are only, or, you know, the final tradable goods themselves are only 35% of overall consumption, and a little bit higher for investment. And then of those tradable goods, only, you know, less than roughly half of those are coming from imports. So then, you know, when you redistribute that lump sum, I don't have the number off the top of my head, but it's some number less than 1% of you know, like GDP per capita. So it's really small for most households. For like a skilled household that makes, you know, above median income, above median wealth, it's minuscule. So that's why for skilled households, who are on average more higher income and higher wealth than unskilled households, this is not going to like cancel out the other negative effects that comes from big, you know, reductions in wages and more expensive goods and services. For unskilled households, though, it is, you know, it's, you know, for the unskilled households, particularly the ones that are kind of at the constraint, this is a big benefit. And even the ones that, you know, are making higher income and temporarily higher wealth, because they might eventually, you know, come down and get unlucky and get bad shocks, and, you know, they might eventually become poor. So the benefit of having that kind of, you know, small insurance is a net gain for unskilled households.
I think one thing you could do would be to, you know, lump sum transfers are like the extreme case of super redistributive, right? But you could think about like the transfers being a function of your income and like parameterize it by some parameter, and then you could find, you know, in one extreme you have lump sum transfers, in the other you have like whatever, they're not very redistributive, and then see how much. I think Adrian's point was how much redistribution do you need in order to get the aggregate welfare gains, right? So yeah, you could do something like that. I think it would be cool, actually.
Can I follow up on that? It would also be cool to do something like what they did in the data, which is to give it all to the farmers in Iowa. Right. I mean, they took the tariff revenue and they gave it to a bunch of rich guys in a politically popular state. So it's not clear, like, you know, the government's kind of got the same preferences and would move these things around in the same way. So
yeah, no,
but
I think
you could sort of tell us like how costly that was, and who, you know, the winners and losers from that kind of redistribution as well.
Right. I mean, yeah, we would have to have a much finer kind of notion of geography and sectors. But I think in the context of doing it in our model, that would be the case with no mobility. So you have, you know, if agriculture is a tradable good. So it would basically be a subsidy to the unskilled tradable set of workers.
But I mean, it was kind of very narrowly targeted to a small group of people. So,
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
for those guys, it was actually a pretty big deal. I think, you know,
That's
I don't
right.
know, I don't know
That's
if Mike found that these guys went and bought trucks or not, but, you know, it's definitely something that the policy that you're thinking about is not really the policy that the government put in
Yeah,
place.
and that's certainly not going to improve the welfare consequences
right,
because
right.
yeah, you're doing nothing for the other kind of poor households that are suffering from the consequences of the tariffs.